Welcome back, graph enthusiasts, to graphstuff.fm, a podcast all about graphs and graph related technologies. And since this is the May episode, May the 4th be with you. Star Wars has been near and dear to my heart for years, and I always love a geeky holiday to celebrate. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, and I'm joined today by fellow advocate ABK.
Hello.
And we are looking forward to chatting with Henry and Mike today. So, Henry Bruce, who is CPO at ExpectAI, Henry is a product leader and experienced in creating and scaling enterprise business intelligence platforms with impact. Before joining ExpectAI, he led the product development team of Mix Market, an institutional and market data service for investors in banking and agriculture globally. Prior to Mix, he spent over a decade building trading and risk management platforms for multinational investment and commercial bank clients. So quite diverse there, I would say. And then Mike Napper is CTO at ExpectAI after 22 years building and leading financial markets trading and analytics systems for large global banks like JP Morgan. Michael switched in 2015 to focus on climate change solutions. He has a deep background in data and analytics on the tech side and in finance and environmental impact broadly, as well as serving as ExpectAI CTO. Michael's also an operating partner at an early stage climate solutions venture capital fund. Setgana? Sorry. Okay, perfect. All right. So, with that, let's dive right in and talk our topics today. So, could you both tell us a little bit about ExpectAI's mission and vision and kind of the backstory there?
Thanks, Jennifer. Really great to be here. Looking forward to sharing a bit about what we're doing and the exciting technologies we have that are enabling that. So, ExpectAI, we're on a mission to reduce 500 megatons of CO2 equivalent. That's carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by the year 2030. That's super ambitious, and we are doing that by enabling organizations, companies to take action that is profitable and will also reduce their carbon footprint. And data is a huge part of that, whether that's public or private data, and how we organize and think about connecting companies with the right information, making decisions based on that, and enabling them to then take that action with providers in the market and banks to finance that is what we're all about.
Michael, do you have some thoughts about that as well? Like any other color to add?
Yeah, delighted to be here. This is Mike. And data is everywhere. There's just so much of it, and it's increasing at a ferocious rate, both structured and unstructured. And our mission is to make sense of that, to connect it, to use it to generate insights. And it's something I've been doing for a long time, but now I'm doing it on the financial market side. There it was all about trading more profitably, and here it's all about saving the world but profitably. And I think that's our mission. How we guide and inform and provide insights to businesses so that they can take action.
So that sounds fascinating to me. I love this mission, but I'll have to admit, even as you spoke through it, it's not immediately obvious to me like how those things connect, how the data to the reducing emissions. I can understand somewhere there's maybe some insights you can realize, like, hey, you're spending you're costing a lot of carbon emissions to happen at this part of your business, in this part of your process. So I guess maybe that's the data to insight connection. So I'm curious if that's true. But then I'm also curious about the next part that you kind of mentioned, that you then somehow have these insights that actually can help profitability, or is it cost savings? So what are those two linkages actually?
Yeah, great question. So first up, the challenge we see around companies in the UK, where we are at the moment, and around the world, is there is this big capacity and capability gap. There's huge awareness that still needs to be built. Education needs to be deployed within staff across organizations, companies, to enable them to change their decision making. Fundamentally, is going to happen to consider emissions and carbon as one of their criteria. And traditionally, this has been, finance kind of operations have been the limit of criteria, and that's going to change, and that is changing already. And the largest companies, the big multinationals, they have the brand, the kind of consumer pressure. They have the resources to dedicate time, people, money to understanding the dynamic where those emitting activities are, what's material to them in the business that they're operating, and what's not, and then start to think about what's the strategy, how can I plan some action, what's going to be involved, how do I manage my team to change their behaviors, maybe their operations, kind of day to day, week to week, but also much more significantly, how do I plan my investment? What financing do I need to change the dynamic and the makeup of the assets that I own as an organization? If you're a wholesaler, you have some vehicles to move things around. If you are a manufacturer, you have machines and tools that build your product, and then you're using, again, probably vehicles to get it to your customers. And all of those things are the artifacts of a world where emissions weren't important, and so we're companies are having to change their operating model, and some are ahead, some are behind, and so that capacity and capability, particularly in these mid-size companies, the kind of longer tail of companies around the world, is missing. And our hope is that, our expectation is that by providing them with the information to make decisions about where that activity is that is emitting and what actions they can take, connect them with providers who can help them take that action, is how we will get the vast majority of companies around the world to actually taking much closer to taking action. And then this is going to be an incremental process, of course, but that capacity and capability is really what we're focused on. That's where the problem is, and we feel like there's a huge opportunity to build that and use technology, particularly data organization and some of the generative AI technologies we've been talking about on the podcast recently, to make that accessible and to be able to incorporate that in decisions.
And just to sort of build on what Henry said there, companies might have a nagging feeling that they could or should be doing something, but they don't know where to start. They don't know who to talk to. They don't know that there are probably 50 things that they could do over the next 4 or 5 years that, and to your other question, that would actually save them money. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And that complexity depends on many variables. It's where you are, what electricity tariff you're on, what fuel costs are doing month to month, how many miles you drive, just looking at the movement use cases. But there's just, where would you start if you were running a 50 person or 100 person or a 500 person business? If you're running a large multinational, you might hire McKinsey or one of the big consultants. There's a very large number of companies who don't have access to that resourcing. So we're trying to just educate and inform, and then crucially provide a pathway to action. And whether that's introducing to service providers or working with our financial partners to bring financing, because even though something may save you money, and I went through this when I switched to electric vehicles, I went through this myself personally when I switched my heating from a gas boiler to a heat pump. That was 7 years ago. Both of those things. I built myself a spreadsheet model because I'm an analytics guy. That's what I do, right? I build a spreadsheet model. Very simple, just like a 5-year total cost of ownership. And what you typically might see, and this is not all solutions, it's just some, is that you need an upfront investment, and that green stuff requires a capital expenditure, and then it's cheaper to run. So my electric cars cost nothing to run, basically. Fuel is almost, I mean, the fuel cost is 80% less than a petrol or a diesel vehicle, and the maintenance is almost zero. There's no, there's no oil to change, and so on and so forth. But it's a more expensive vehicle at the outset. So, that's just one very micro example that, I lived from a personal capacity. But if you multiply that by 100 possible things that you could do across 5 million companies or whatever it is in the UK, and then you look at that globally, those data points are what are going to enable people to understand what they could do, and it will be very personalized. It will be what makes sense in the context of your business, your bottom line, your financial situation, and that's what we're about.
If I can share an
Yeah.
anecdote, I was in a taxi yesterday going across London, and it was an EV, and I asked the driver, who was an Uber driver, how he found charging his EV, and we kind of progressed the conversation on to would he buy an EV again? Would he buy a combustion engine vehicle? And the context that's required to make that decision. There's currently a waiver for the congestion charge in London for electric vehicles, which is substantial, but the current legislation is set to run out or not be renewed or elapse next year, and so that's a factor for him. His current kind of schedule allows him to go home to charge, so he doesn't have to wait for a charger in the city, which are usually occupied by the black cabs. All of these different criteria, current, future, potential, the context that's required for him to make the decision about what's the total cost of ownership exactly. It's the same, Michael, for him to run an EV versus a combustion engine vehicle for his business as a taxi driver in London is extensive, and this is where we think there's a huge opportunity to bring data together, and part of why we're here talking to you on Neo is about that, the ability of graph technology to bring that context to bear on a particular decision or a particular point in time.
I love the way that you're framing that right there, and the points you're both bringing up, and think back all the way to, Michael, your spreadsheet, that for you, where any given problem, you probably reach for a spreadsheet as your first tool. I don't know, it could be breakfast tomorrow, you're going to create a spreadsheet for it first, possibly, right? But not everyone is going to be like that. And even like on a business level, businesses have those same kinds of behaviors. And for a topic like this, they might have some notion that they should do something, but they don't know what to do. And like the impacts are invisible to them. The costs are invisible to them because they just don't know. And so is that part of the kind of your insight here, is that you're making this visible to them so that they can make the right decisions and actually see where the return on investment is, if there's an initial investment to be made, to then in the long term, like in the 5-year, whatever the time period is, that's actually going to be beneficial to their business. Is that the overall idea?
I think that's the starting point, certainly, to provide them with that visibility. And what's exciting is that there's this spectrum of actions that span behavioral, kind of operational things that can be put into practice today, tomorrow, next week, next month, and that there are these much more substantial actions to kind of infrastructure and assets that require financial planning and building permits and all these other things. So the different level of context and requirements to put into practice. So there is a spectrum, and it's exciting to kind of work along some of those nearer term things, but also the more substantial things typically are where there is more financial investment required, and more parties need to come together and say, we're going to change an entire fleet of logistics vehicles from combustion engines to EVs, or we're going to use hydrogen HGVs, which are barely out of kind of running on the road yet, but are seem to be a viable option for heavier loads, and maybe that's something that's planned for in a bit of the longer term.
Something I'll just also kind of touch on, and I think this will be music to graph aligned ears, which is that all of this is connected and interlocked and interwoven. So, for example, we have a very large data set of companies, right? There are supply chain relationships between them. There are regulatory pressures that are increasing. There are consumer pressure, levers that are starting to come into effect, and pressure is starting to be exerted up and down the supply chain. And people are demanding sustainability data from their suppliers. And what are you going to do? What's your action plan for reducing your footprint environmentally, broadly speaking, not just carbon, but water, air pollution, etc. There's also a network of financial relationships. So a big lever is asset managers who invest in, invest our pensions, our savings in companies. They're exerting pressure on boards, and banks, commercial banks, who run accounts and loans for any number of businesses, thousands and thousands of businesses. They are under pressure to enable their businesses to reduce their emissions, because that counts as part of the bank's carbon footprint. And every now and again, this flares up into a headline article in the press. There's a web. It's intrinsically a graph, if you think about it that way, of relationships between companies, between regulations and where they apply, between suppliers and customers, between financiers and their customers. So a graph structure feels very natural for that. But that also relates to the point that all of these things are interconnected. So it's climate change is a system level problem. So you need to look at all the details, but you also need to approach it from a systems thinking perspective as well.
I really like the approach too, that you're looking at this from yes, this is a big matter, and yes, things, need to make a change, but in order for there to be change, it has to feel reachable and feasible to people, both cost wise as well as action wise, and like long term, bigger systems changes, as you were just mentioning. And I think that's one big thing for especially, individuals, smaller companies, even some of the larger companies. Maybe your really big ones see this as, well, this is us giving back, to the planet, to the future, and so on. It's almost like it's an investment that's going to reap rewards eventually down the line, even though right now they may not be seeing that. But for smaller companies, for individuals, that may not always be financially or time-wise feasible. I mean, that may not, their business may not survive through that. And so to give them data and ways that they can start making incremental changes now that are very feasible, very reachable, very cost effective, I think is really going to help get everybody kind of on board and like, okay, I can do this, or this company can make these shifts over time. This is something that now we can put on the plan because now it feels more reachable. It's not just something that big companies or countries are doing overall. It's something we can all participate in.
Yeah, absolutely right, Jennifer. And I think maybe here to add that we've talked about actions and to put this in the context of kind of how we're going to solve the climate crisis, kind of broadly, what these actions that companies can take to reduce their emissions. This is insetting. This is kind of the reduction absolutely of emitting activities. The other opposite and kind of more popularly understood potentially part of the reduction the reduction pathways are offsets. Offsets have been in the press a lot about. There's been a lot of controversy about the quality of offsets. Offsets are, we continue to emit, but we'll support some activities that take carbon out of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and achieve some balance. We're very much focused on insetting, actually reducing emitting activities, because there are not enough trees to plant to offset all of the emitting activities humans currently undertake. So to solve the climate crisis, we are going to need to do lots of insetting, and that's going to require alignment with the incentives of companies and economies as they exist today. And so the profitable piece is really important. And I think kind of back to the example a little bit, and some of what Michael was talking about, the kind of the spreadsheet is that element of, it's not just about today, it's about, if you don't take that action, what is the cost of that to you? And it can seem like, to this taxi driver, it made sense to, based on his experience today, to not buy a replacement EV if he had to tomorrow. But if you take into account all of those future things that are going to impact the total cost of ownership for him of running his car, the increase in the cost of fuel, the reduction in the price of electricity, the potential extension of the pass for EVs in central London, the congestion zone, all of these things and how we expect them to change over time, and making that accessible, kind of available in that moment to allow users across the organization to plan better is going to be really important.
I'm now curious, given all this, and what, in some ways, this is a classic graph scenario where you guys have had the insight, like, oh my gosh, all these things are connected. If we knew all these things and we could share this with companies, we could make a case for them for like how they could improve their business and their footprint. I'm curious on two levels, both where you guys went from concept to like, you've got to start somewhere with the data and gathering the insights and building the case. How did that go? And I guess this is maybe a long two-parter, but the second one is then in practice with an engagement with a kind of a business of the kind of in your target audience, I guess I'll say, like, a business of a certain size. Where do you start with them? And is that mirrored in the data that you've collected as well?
Shall I jump in on the data piece?
Yeah. Please, yeah.
So I first met, my first graph database was I met Neo4j in September, I think it was. Maybe it was October. And I think it was, I forget the exact name of the book, but I think it was by Dr. Barrera and somebody else. Or maybe he wrote the foreword. But anyway, it was graph databases written by by people who are from Neo4j, and I was like, wow, okay, this is different. I spent many years doing a lot of both relational databases and time series databases. Financial market data is a very particular beast that comes at fairly ferocious bit rates, and is quite large, but it's quite uniform in its structure because it's just market data. But so the graph was a fairly novel concept to me, but I just was immediately impressed, as I'm sure many people have been. And also it was super easy to get started. I mean, the kudos to whoever writes the onboarding documentation. The everything is there that you need to get started. I mean, it was really a very good onboarding experience, and just grabbed a whole load of public data, lots of it, and built a graph. And it sounds quite straightforward. It wasn't. There were a few evenings in November where it didn't feel that straightforward, but and there were some late nights. But actually, one of the things I love is that you have a first version of your schema, and I know it's sort of not really a schema, but your data model, your data semantics, I guess you would use as the proper term, and then you learn, and you can iterate on it quite organically. Yeah, it's very different than the traditional. Here's your logical data model. Here's your physical data model, and oh no, dear, I need to change this table or whatever. So I personally, I was learning the product as well at the same time as learning graphs in general, at the same time as discovering the data sources and trying to put it all together. And I suspect I'm not the first one to tread that path. And it was a very good experience. And then I forget your exact question, but how did we? I mean, we've got we've got data points on basically 5 million companies in the UK, and we've got about 3 years of historical data on them. And then what we've done is we've then layered on our own data that's derived from that, which is our own secret sauce, our proprietary models, and to generate the insights. And all of that fits quite naturally into a graph structure. So going back to Andreas's question, did I answer? I think it was a two-parter. Did I answer?
You did. So that was the first part, is like where you started with the graph, and it sounds like you kind of took an incremental approach, if I would say, like, you just put some data in and then see what, take a look at it. Does it work? Does it answer questions you want? And then kind of just kept iterating. Is that fair?
I think that's exactly fair. And I just call out again, the quality of the documentation and all the YouTube videos and all the rest of it was, it didn't feel like a heavy lift, right? Actually getting the data and understanding it and making sense of it was the bigger piece of the work.
Right.
And then, as you say, it took me a while to get my head around the difference between create and merge. I mean, dumb stuff like that. I mean, right? It's like, okay, read the manual properly. Okay, okay, right, yeah, I get it. And you get your nodes and your relationships, and it's quite organic, right? That's how it felt. It does. I've seen this in somebody else made this point in a recent pod on this series. It's kind of how your brain sort of thinks. It's much more intuitive than a relational structure with COD second normal form and all the rest of it. Which is what I've been doing for a long time. So that was a good change. And I think, what was the second part?
Can I add, Michael? I think
go ahead.
The tooling as well. Like, if you ask Michael right to now go back to traditional relational database tooling, we would balk at the idea, strongly disagree, the graph visualization of the graph database. I mean, we use it all the time to establish, what data is where, and those connections and relationships, because that's such an important part of the data set that we have. So we've really, the workspace preview and the Bloom presentations of the nodes, that's been so critical, and we wouldn't. I think either of us would anticipate going back to Postgres, a desktop app or whatever.
It does have that quality about it that, like, once you start to have any kind of initial successes with it, it really just draws you in, and it's being almost kind of fun to work with data, if that's possible. I still have, after more than 10 years of doing graph stuff now, I still just have a fun time working with graphs.
We had our board meeting yesterday, a quarterly board meeting, and I brought up a query in Workspace Preview with Bloom presentation, and it's so accessible to everyone to see. Oh, these are how they're related, and kind of you expand a node and you see the others appear, and it's like it's kind of a magical presentation, but it's so easy and accessible to understand for all users, technical and non-technical alike.
So that almost leads into the second part of my question then, which was now that you've built up this internal database with historical data about companies, in the UK and elsewhere, like, whatever the range is and all the different data sources, similar to, like, presenting to the board, is that part of the bridge over when you approach businesses and say, hey, here's our view of the world. We'd love to show you where you fit in, and where is that the lead into the conversation of, like, here's what your options are for trying to improve your footprint? What does that engagement look like?
Yeah, absolutely right. So by starting from public data, we're giving companies a huge head start. Coming back to the capacity and capability piece, a lot of the work at the moment is very emissions focused. Go and source all the data from across your organization, regardless of its materiality or relevance to calculating your emissions, and we can give you the perfect number. And congratulations, it's 2.54 kilotons a year of CO2 equivalent. Great. So this accurate number, but what should I do with that? Are we taking the approach of working back from action? Yes, emissions are important, but reducing those and understanding what is material, to understanding the kind of the next best recommended action, is where companies want to start, and what does the return on investment, carbon versus financial, look like, and how can they work with that to match their kind of business priorities and their willingness to take or invest their own money or work with banks to ultimately reduce their emissions.
Yeah, that goal is great, but working, you can't flip a switch and make that goal today. So what can you do in the interim to start working towards that?
Exactly, there are multiple tracks always, and that helps us identify then what is what are the data points that are really important to understanding it's this aspect of your business, this operation, this asset that is going to be critical, and you should, if you can do something about it today, great. If you can't, let's start planning to do something about that in 3 years or 5 years time, because this is going to be really significant to you reducing your footprint and hopefully saving money along the way. A lot of these assets as they're replaced or added are profitable with the right, with the financing piece connected.
We haven't really dived into the Gen AI piece particularly yet, but I think to the point of how do we engage with a company, it's the old adage, meet the customer where either where they are or where they want to meet you, right? So we've given a lot of thought to this, and we're on a Gen AI journey, as well as sitting on top of bedrock of a knowledge graph. So AI plays in different ways. It helps us source unstructured data and turn it into something that's tractable in a structured graph environment, whether that's text or PDFs or whatever, right? It also allows us to, and this is one of the key kind of differentiators that we focus on, is we provide a natural language interface, a conversational interface to the user base, right? And that is very powerful. You can just have a chat with the data, right? We also recognize that there are some types of data that render better as a chart or as a table. So we have that integrated. So we have a multimodal conversational interface that sits on top of the graph, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's easy to describe in audio, but you can imagine anyone who's used Chat GPT or something like that. You ask it a question, it gives you an answer. In our case, sometimes that answer will just be a textual answer with perhaps some numbers in it, or you've asked about what regulations are relevant to your company. You've asked, what should you do? Why should you do it? You've asked, why should I bother with any of this? Very existential questions, or very tactical questions like, tell me about what is SBTI, is Science-Based Targets Initiative, and it will explain. And we've got a library of curated content that we will answer your qualitative questions and your quantitative questions. And if it's a very quanti answer, like here's a roadmap for 5 years or 10 years worth of carbon action, we'll put a chart in there where it makes sense. So interleaved in the conversational interface is what we would call graphical elements or traditional UI elements. We don't believe that's the end of the story. We would expect, perhaps on the enterprise client side, to potentially provide access via an API to the graph. If you've got a good data structure, you can deploy it in different ways. So for the person running a 40 person company, we are your chief sustainable officer in your pocket, right? Basically, yeah.
On a more technical note, Michael, because you were leading the development of the agent Pete and Lance was on the podcast a few episodes ago from LangChain, and we were using the Gen AI stack initially. Maybe you share a bit of your experience on it might be interesting to share a bit of your experience on the development of that agent, which is sits behind which is LangChain based and sits behind the conversational UI.
Absolutely. Is that something that's of interest to your listeners? I was going to say viewers.
For sure.
And then I stopped
Yeah.
myself. Yeah. So we absolutely have deployed an agent, and it has a carefully constructed, fairly long now prompt telling it what it should do, and we have made available to it a number of tools, and we follow the LangChain terminology here, which is probably familiar to at least the two of you, if not everyone in the audience. So a tool is essentially a piece of code that could do something, right? And the agent is told, well, here's 10 different tools. This is what each one is for, right? Pick the one that is appropriate to what the user has just asked. And
right.
if it's a qualitative question about regulations, we might go and dip into our do a vector search on our carefully curated content, and the large language model would pick that tool, and we'd go and call it. We'd go and take the results and package it back up and give it back to the user. And this all happens in typically between 1 and 2 seconds. So we're trying to be fairly quick. Or it might be a quantitative tool. So what's my carbon reduction plan? And then it would, generate a bunch of numbers. And this is where, LangChain allows us to iterate pretty quickly. And again, they have excellent onboarding documentation as well. And full disclosure, I've never written Python before December. So,
Wow.
I can jump onto that bandwagon as well, because I hadn't really looked at it until probably late last year, early this year as well. So it's new for me too.
And the fact that LangChain and Neo seem to have such a relationship is obviously very helpful for us. And I think the stuff is accelerating so fast, it can get a little bit dizzying, just the pace of change. And we always, I'm a technologist. I was, I was coding as a kid. I wrote assembly code when I was, just for fun when I was a kid. It was a long time ago. And the thing we always have to, focus on is what is the commercial and impact relevance of what we're deploying. So that the technology is evolving so fast and so powerfully, and we're making a bet effectively that there are things that we can't do now that we'd love to do, that there's a pretty good chance in 6 months or 12 months, OpenAI or LangChain or Neo4j. The fact that you've got vector databases natively in the graph was that's pretty cool. Vector search index. So these technologies are evolving so fast. So our challenge is just to keep up with the pace of change, but always to harness it to the mission and to things that are. And we're private. We're a for-profit company, so we also have to serve customers and deliver commercial value to everyone, including ourselves.
Right. Which sometimes, as a developer, can be a challenge, right? When you're deep down in the code. And first you're just, building things, maybe you're fixing things, and it's easy to just keep building because you're now just almost having fun, right? You're just kind of exploring the space, expanding what's possible, but keeping in the back of your mind the mission that you're trying to achieve, who the user is and what they're trying to do. Is it, as a developer, sometimes a challenge. How do you guys balance that?
We like to say to ourselves fairly regularly, this is not a research project. Okay. And if for a moment we forget that, our chief exec Anand would remind us. But my core focus for my second career since these last 10 years has been solving the climate crisis. So that's my North Star. So I don't find it difficult to manage that tension. And also, back in my previous career, I ran, very, very large, very expensive very high throughputs, pretty scary scale algorithmic trading systems. So you very quickly focus on how do you harness technology to a commercial aim. That's second nature to me. Is it needs to work, right? It needs to deliver business value, right? When those things go wrong, it gets very ugly very quickly.
So you very much have internalized those both kind of missions at once in your own head, like they're both top of mind at all times.
I think Andreas, on applying that question to the data side and the kind of knowledge side, it does get harder. And talking about kind of creating conversational interfaces using large language models that are agent managed, that don't necessarily do what you tell them to do, and that's by design, and also kind of frustrating sometimes when you're typing in all caps, please do absolutely do this thing. Always, absolutely. 3 exclamation marks,
and then it doesn't,
and it doesn't listen.
It's
Exactly right. It really is, and the data side as well. How much is enough data? How accurate does it need to be? How complete? How are you putting the number in context? Is it you're trying to quantify those accuracy and completeness metrics for a kind of a company to make a decision based on those versus a bank? There's different levels of expectation around what the number means and represents, and how do you present some of that kind of that calculation and the explainability and context behind the number. It is much more of a grey scale. And I think the way that I try to think about it is we get in front of our customers and our users and say, what else do you want to know? And that's also one of the interesting things about the conversational UI as an interface, is that you actually can see then from the conversation where they're going next in a way that is much harder in a traditional visual presentation. You're explicitly saying where the user can and can't go next, and maybe you have some support or help or chatbot or something to kind of ask questions to, but that's not part of the experience. Whereas, and we'll come to that in kind of the tools of the month, we're really excited by some of the conversational UI as a means actually to understand the user behavior much more kind of intuitively, and not give them, it's also a challenge, but not give them not constrain them to, you must do this next. So if you don't want to do that, what do you do? And that's a great feedback mechanism for us as we've been developing this.
It's a brilliant observation. Like that sort of anticipatory design has been a UI goal forever, but always hard to do. And it's a great observation. Like, actually, now that we're in the middle of a context of chatting, like you can see the history, a little bit about the user, you're better able to think what might be coming next. And of course, LLMs are designed to anticipate what's coming next. In the that idea of the feedback, have you incorporated that into the loop as well, so that do the users actively kind of self-curate as things are coming back, like, actually this was not helpful or it was helpful, and you keep a record of that?
So we're using Langsmith, which you can talk a bit more about, to collect all of this conversational history and the use of the tools, as Michael was saying. I think this interface development is relatively novel, so we're excited to be on this journey. And what is the right balance of guiding versus supporting versus kind of responding to requests for guidance versus trying to kind of push guidance? And there's definitely some trial and error and seeing kind of what works in what context, or as to whether we are more kind of dynamic, or we want to try and take users on an arc, or there's a kind of a narrative, this broader narrative we talked about, from kind of education and awareness through to taking action. And we have this arc, this narrative that we want to take users on through the platform and demonstrate all of our capabilities and get them to taking action. And when is it appropriate to kind of take them to the next stage? Or when do they want to kind of explore and explain a bit more where they are at the moment, if they're kind of looking at a particular initiative and aren't quite sure that it's ready for them to take that action yet. Maybe they need a bit more confidence or kind of context, or what are the considerations. So we're winding our way through some of those decisions, and I think it is going to be very interesting to see what works and what doesn't, and we're all learning at the same time, which is really exciting.
There's two things just to layer on top of that. So right from the outset, I put in an evaluator, which for the moment is assessing helpfulness. So you get the agent to answer the user's question, and asynchronously, you then feed that whole conversation chain and the answer to the LLM and ask it to evaluate it. And we persist that in Langsmith. So that just gives a score from 0 to 1 of helpfulness. You could imagine expanding that. And it does actually work. It's like, that is a treasure trove of information to help us be more helpful, basically. And the other thing is that this is what Henry was talking about. This cognitive journey is the sort of the theory that we're trying to put into practice. So we ask the LLM to work out effectively some suggested next questions that the user might want to ask. And this, again, as Henry said, this is a winding trail, and we're just learning as we go. So this may look very different next month, but one of my fears has always been, how quickly do people type, and how patient will they be for typing? And if they don't know what they could ask, how will they ever learn, right? We don't publish a user guide, right? The idea is that the whole thing teaches you how to use it. So we suggest 4 typically suggested next questions. You just asked about X. So have you thought about asking 3 other questions in the same neighborhood? And we actually, all they have to do is click on the question, and it just runs it. And here's another question, which, if you're ready to take that next step in that journey, this question opens the door to the next room in the house, if you like.
Right. It is. Choose your own adventure at this point, right? It's
correct. But equally, you can just ignore all that and just type, right? Yeah. So I wouldn't say we've got all that figured out yet, but that's the approach, and we can only and we've got this very diverse set of users, and something that we're looking at is you have a diversity of technical computer knowledge, like what's ChatGPT? Never heard of it, right? What right? So people are perhaps used to using a spreadsheet, or maybe the limit of their tech knowledge is how to send an email. So there's a spectrum. There's some experts, there's some people who are less experienced, but equally on the climate axis, you've got a very broad, very diverse set of experience and knowledge level. So we always have to try and intuit where the user is on those various axes and meet them where they are and deliver something valuable to them. And that's not trivial, but it's interesting and it's very powerful.
You guys are incorporating so many kind of next level advanced AI patterns already. To your point, everyone's talking about Gen AI, this year, certainly, I think in all industries. And yet in practice, there's still very few people who are doing things. Everyone would like to, but nobody's necessarily taking the time to. And you guys are pretty much pushing the edge with, it sounds to me like, all the different elements you're really combining into this, with the agentic approach, like the multiple tools within an agent, and then all of the feedback mechanisms you've got. I think this sounds really pretty marvelous.
And so how many exclamation
kudos
marks
to you on what you've done, and learn Python in the meantime, and learn this for the first time. Like, not a bad first job.
Well, I'm getting very good at writing all caps and exclamation marks in the system prompt. If in doubt, add another capital letter. That's and the other thing is that there's just so many different language models now. Like, again, you could just get lost in this, and again, it could become a research project. So we have to keep bringing it back. And there's always trade-offs as well. Like GPT-4's underlying model is more powerful, and it's great for writing cipher, but it's slower and it's more expensive, right? And you look at what's going on with Meta and the open source models. I mean, it's just like, how do you even keep up with the news, let alone harness that into something that's production grade? So it's it's never dull.
I have to say though, so this is the kind of conversation I love, because this is really interesting on basically every level. Like, it's interesting as a business proposition, certainly on the social impact, the social good that's coming out of your mission is amazing. And then obviously we can geek out on the tech stack. I have a bunch of follow-up questions on pretty much everything you've mentioned. Maybe we'll have to invite you guys back, maybe in a month, actually, if you're saying you don't know what a month out would look like. Maybe we'll have to come back around and be like, actually, the stuff we said last month, totally wrong, useless. We've got a new approach. It's going to be a fun follow-up. But we've gotten, I think, close to the our time for this part of the segment. It's been marvelous having you, Michael and Henry. Thank you both for all that you've been sharing with us.
Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Do you guys? We're going to head into the tools of the month. Is that right, Jennifer? Is that up next?
Yeah, that's good with me. So I'll just go ahead and toss mine out there really quickly. With the podcast editing that I've actually been doing on graph stuff for a little bit now, I've been using Descript, and this was something that previous person doing the editing was working with as well, and I've just kind of started really enjoying it. It does really well. You drop a video or audio file in, it will kind of do an automated first guess transcript for you, and then as you make edits inside the transcript, it will edit the video for you if you so choose. But you can also make transcript edits, customized. You can remove filler words and things like that. And it just does a really great job as just like a first swath, quickly get me from point A to point B kind of thing. So really nice features there. They have, I think, a nice free tier as well as some subscription levels too. So that's just been kind of fun playing around with that and getting to know that tool. It does a pretty good job. So
shout out to Descript. I'm going to stay, onto the Gen AI track here, and we have our own tool. Lots of things going on actually with the Neo4j, but the one I want to call out that has just been out for a couple of weeks is the LLM Graph Builder. Our guests today, Michael and Henry, have been handcrafting a graph, which is an incredible undertaking. But it's intimidating, I think, for people who are just kind of like taking their first steps. This LLM Graph Builder is a nice kind of first step. If you're interested in these kinds of topics, you'd like to build something, but you're not quite sure where to start and how to kind of shape a graph. This LLM Graph Builder lets you take some text files, some PDF files, whatever you might have. Even you can reach out to YouTube videos. It'll allow you to call out to Wikipedia if you want to, and just put a graph together. And then it'll show you the graph that was assembled. It'll do some interesting things with with the text, breaking the text apart, but also doing what's called name entity recognition to pull out the people, places, and things, and creating a graph around the unstructured data. And then within the same interface, you get to have a small chat with whatever graph, was a result of that. It's kind of general purpose, and with most general purpose tools, like, you get a lovely out of the box experience. It's a good place to start to understand what's possible and how to think about what a graph might look like. And if you're just getting started, again, I think this is an awesome place to start. Just Google for LLM Graph Builder. We'll include the link as well, I guess, in the show notes. It's a great new tool that's available. Henry and Michael, you guys have got a tool as well you want to bring up.
Yeah, no, just on that, Andreas, the kind of the stacks of these tools that are coming out of the Neo team are super useful, and we've used many of them ourselves already, and they have helped us accelerate our journey so much. So keep up the great work on that. Really second that. That's a fantastic kit. I mentioned Langsmith earlier. You had Lance talking about it briefly. We've been using it in earnest and have talked about ways that we're using it to understand the interaction with our conversational UI and the possibility with these evaluators. It's just coming out of its kind of beta phase. They launched their pricing, I think, a few weeks ago. Not to promo Langsmith on their behalf, but we found it really useful and invaluable in understanding kind of what our agent is doing and what value our users are getting or not. So big shout out to the Langsmith product from the LangChain team there.
I had 2 tools of the month, and that was one of them. I spend a lot of time on Langsmith, and observability is everything with large, complex systems. Whether it's for debugging in dev or testing in QA or what just happened in production. I mean, it's everything, right? You're blind without it, and it does really help us. The other one, which is not particularly work related, only indirectly, is I guess it is related, and I'll explain why. I've switched probably really the last 6 months to Obsidian for my personal knowledge management, and also I keep my to-do lists in there. And it's a great tool. If anyone doesn't know it, I don't own shares, but I highly recommend it. It's pretty good, and it's a very rich framework of community plugins as well, which means it can do all sorts of things. But the reason I made that switch away from traditional SaaS to-do list was the key feature, which is what appeals to many people, is basically the data set is just a really big set of markdown files, which all live on my Linux laptop and on my phone via replication, and I back them up to GitHub and stuff. So I am most of the way through the process of transferring 9 years worth of climate learnings, hundreds of podcast notes, podcast transcripts, Kindle highlights, all sorts of stuff from Google Docs or wherever they are. I'm not doing it by hand. There's obviously some scripting going on there, right? So it's a side project. But basically, once all of that data, which is textual and some structured, but mostly textual, guess what I'm going to do with it? I'm going to write a semantic RAG search on it, right? I'm just going to spin it
fantastic.
up. Yeah, I'll probably I'll probably spin up an Aura instance or a DB instance for myself, put it in there, and then it's I already use LLM type tools, and I've kind of I forget what it's called. The Tably have a actually it's now a product. I started playing with it when it was just some GitHub code to run research. So, and I sometimes use that with my venture capital hat on as well. So tell me about all the companies that are active in this nascent industry, and it just goes off and searches and then gives you a nice kind of research report. I want to start doing that. So it's all about having your data in a place where it's got the relationships, and Obsidian is kind of a graph. It has a graph view because it's all about backlinks between this note relates to that note, this one relates to that one. But even just having everything in a bunch of markdown files in a folder structure means you can start running RAG searches on it.
Yeah.
And off you go, right? Suddenly, like, what was that thing? I'm scratching my head for those on audio. Where did I read about that thing about the other thing? And suddenly, your second brain becomes that much more powerful. Yeah. So that's currently I'm just doing that as a background job, migrating all the data, and then as you can imagine, spinning up a simple RAG tool on that for my own personal use will not be too hard, right? And then some of that content will probably find its way, if licensing and data ownership restrictions are not in the way, it can find its way into our curated content. And we're about guiding people and how to navigate, how to start and then follow their climate journey. So it's all of that knowledge is dispersed at the moment in text and structured and unstructured and all the rest of it. So ways to grapple with that and make it useful and informative are very, very key.
That is brilliant. Great stuff.
All right. Well, we really appreciate both you, Henry and Michael, for joining us today and kind of walking through kind of the data side of things as well as the business side of things at ExpectAI. And we hope to be able to chat with you again sometime soon and continue the conversation.
We'd love to. Yeah. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for having us.
Absolutely. Love to speak to you.
Great. So then, Jen, what's our next segment up then? We've gotten through the tools, and now we're into guest articles of the month and videos, and right?
Yep. We'll just kind of toss out a couple of highlights, and Henry, Michael, feel free to stay on or drop off if you'd like. But we'll just kind of drop into Neo4j related things if there's any highlights we want to focus on.
Thanks.
But
Thank you.
hopefully, lovely to meet you both, and
Thanks so much.
thanks for your time. Huh? Right.
Cheers,
You as
fellas.
well.
Till next time.
All right.
Cheers.
Bye.
Okay. So, is there anything, Andreas, you particularly want to highlight this month? I'll be sure to list everything in show notes for folks, so you can get a rundown of everything that's going on.
I have to say that every time that I look through the articles, and I've been trying to keep up, as always happens, like it is such a fire hose of amazing content that picking out the favorites is always a little bit difficult for me.
Yes.
And of course, I tend to fixate on the Gen AI stuff, and most of it is Gen AI stuff, so that doesn't
Right.
actually help narrow down the problem too
Right.
much. So I'll just say, like, I appreciate all the articles that have been coming out, and all of the authors of them have been doing amazing work. And we'll just include them all in the show notes. I think the highlights are: read each of these articles when you've got some time, add it to your reading list if you want to learn even more about actually some of the topics that were touched on today. Knowledge graph construction articles, which are amazing. Where to start is really hard to figure out. Some of these articles are good for that. And then what does it actually mean to like do things like advanced RAG, like beyond just, you start with some vector search, you've got text, you do the vector search. That's a good first step. By day 2, you realize, okay, that's got some limitations. What do you do next? You'll eventually find your way down to the path that Henry and Michael were on, where you can have an agent-based approach, which means lots of different, strategies for accessing information. Each of these blogs touches on different aspects of that problem. So I don't have a particular order that you should go through them in, but they're all like worth taking a look at. And if you're on this journey right now, you'll find really good information here.
Yeah, and I would kind of segueing on from that too. We've kind of been doing a highlight of our Nodes 2023 playlist on our YouTube channel. However, it was just released that the CFP for Nodes 2024 is now open, and it will close June 15th. So if you are interested in either one, attending the event, so you can register now to save your spot, or 2, submitting your graph learning journey or story or business case or anything along those lines. The more technical, the better for us. But please do head out to Nodes 2024. I'll put the link in the show notes for the site and the local place to find all the details. But definitely submit something, register so that you've saved your spot for this coming November.
That's a great call out, Janet. And like, there's again, like in this theme of like, there's so many things going on. All of them are like high value. We haven't even touched on the ISO GQL announcement.
Oh,
That,
yes.
this historical milestone that, incidentally kind of passed by, that first there's SQL 40 years ago that became obviously the dominant way of how to query databases, structured query language, right? And there's been other sort of database standards since then, query language standards since then that have happened, but that they haven't come from ISO. So they haven't been International Standards Organization blessed standards. But now there's ISO GQL, which is not GraphQL, but Graph Query Language, which is a query language that is now an international standard that is based, of course, on Cypher, all inspired by Cypher. A huge collaborative effort. We were participating in that, but along with like lots of other partner organizations, a lot of amazing people got together and built this language, and it's now public. It was very quietly released by ISO because they don't have a great PR department, or maybe any PR department. You'll start to see lots of articles about this. Keep an eye out for that. And I think in another week or 2, we're actually going to have a little QA chat with a couple of people from Neo4j who are involved in the process from the beginning, from proposing the standard and then following through to actually having the standard, published. It's an amazing journey from Cypher was just some offhanded idea that Neo4j had some number of years ago, and has gotten to this point now where it's an international standard. It's an amazing kind of journey and an accomplishment for Neo4j, to pat ourselves in the back a little bit. But it is
And
unbelievable to me that this has happened.
but by the same token too, I think that bringing other vendors into the space and other experts that are not just Neo4j experts, but just kind of general technologists and other, graphs and graph query languages that might exist out there, bringing this all together is super helpful for developers, because it sets a code of standards. If Neo4j went off and did something crazy and rebellious, in 3 years, that's that that would affect and change the direction of a graph query language, where this setting a standard for this ensures that, no one person, no one vendor could make drastic shifts. It's, kind of setting a standard for this is how developers should approach this, and setting this consistency that's going to help developers long term, as well as maintainability and learning and all of that down the line too. So really amazing for us, but as well as for developer, technologists, vendor populations everywhere.
Absolutely. A great new chapter in the story of graphs, right?
Yeah.
So that's something to look forward to, both in blog posts and videos coming up soon. For events that are coming up, what's a highlight you've noticed here?
So there's lots of hands-on labs going on, I've noticed. So if you're wanting to get, really hands-on, play with the technology, to actually do something and accomplish something with it, but in a very incremental and guided way, definitely check some of those out. They range all over the country, I've noticed, or all over the world. Excuse me. There's some in plenty of various countries around the globe. Lots of meetups, a few webinars. So if you're, not local or difficult to get local to different places, there's some virtual options too out there. So be sure to check those out across the spectrum of big data conferences, Gen AI meetups and hands-on labs, some various technologies that are all kind of coming together. So yeah, check those out. Quite a few events happening throughout the course of May. We're jumping into kind of pre-summer stuff, so it's like get all the events in before everybody heads off on vacations. But yeah, some really great things. So be sure to check those out, and I'll be sure to link everything in the show notes as well.
And as you mentioned at the top of the show, Jennifer, of course, coming up in May as well, of all the dates, the most important one, May the 4th be with you.
Yes. And also to you. So hopefully we'll have some nerdy, geeky things coming out for that day. So be sure to check those out too, or keep posted, and feel free to post your own if you have some Neo4j graph related things that coincide with Star Wars and May the 4th. By all means, post those. And we will be happy to promote those and repost those, and kind of carry that conversation and have a little fun. So
awesome. Good stuff, Jen. Hey, great hour spending with you and Michael Henry. This was a really nice episode.
Yes, I enjoyed it, and look forward to chatting with you again, hopefully next episode.
Cool.
All right. Bye, everyone.